Good morning, guys. Looks like we've got a couple early risers tuning into the webinar. Welcome, Ben, Drew, and Sandy. Thank you guys so much for showing up for Ken's first webinar. Hope everyone is having a lovely day. Got about one more minute here, and then we will get started with our introductions. Oh, welcome, Brant and Drew. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Hope I pronounced that right, Brant. If you guys want to familiarize yourself with the questions bar, you can type in where you are tuning in from. Welcome, Dennis. Thanks for joining us. And Michael. Good morning, guys. Hope you've got your coffee or water, whatever you choose to drink in the morning. Hopefully water. All right, it is 9 o'clock, so we will get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Cassie Hopkins, and I am your host for this webinar for Houseman Group. I would like to welcome you to this webinar, Fleet Best Practices and DOT Update, which is presented by Ken Alderden. This webinar is interactive and will feature a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. You can type a question in at any time and Ken will address it. There will be a short survey after the webinar is over that we're hoping you can fill out for us. It really helps us put together brand new ideas as well as give speaker feedback and anything else you'd like to tell us about our webinars. This webinar will also be recorded, and a copy of the presentation slides and a link to the webinar archives section of our website will be emailed to each presentation. Each attendee will receive a follow-up email, and now I would like to introduce you to our speaker, Ken. Ken joined Houseman Group in 2022 with over 30 years of experience in the insurance safety field. He has worked both on the carrier and agency side, giving him a unique perspective into the ins and outs of safety at companies both large and small. Ken focuses on construction safety in particular, working with clients on fleet safety, FMCSA issues, and large property fire protection. When Ken encounters a problem, he prides himself on making practical suggestions to improve safety that are not only effective at reducing risk, but also are practical to the business owners with their investment of time and money. When Ken is not giving safety webinars or events or seminars, you can find him landscaping in his yard, tinkering with machines in his garage, or spending time with his family. He loves to do anything outdoors and has coached baseball, softball, basketball, and soccer over the years. Ken has a BS in occupational safety from UW-Whitewater and is a OSHA outreach trainer for construction safety. Welcome, Ken. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, and thanks for the introduction, and welcome everybody. So, as Cassie mentioned, I'm relatively new to the Houseman Group. I've started about 2 months ago, came from the carrier side, and that's one of the things we're going to kind of talk about today a little bit is some of the best practices, because on the carrier side, there was not a monthly sales meeting that would go by without hearing discussions of the rates and the constant concerns that we have on the fleet side of things. And there's still some ongoing things that we'll talk about here, some continuous fleet issues. It's one policy line. We might have seen some reductions on some of the work comp codes in Wisconsin here, but we have certainly seen rates on auto going up, not just from the carrier I came from, but from a lot of them. So we'll talk about that ongoing fleet issue. We'll talk about some of the thresholds where DOT rules and regulations start to apply, because I do see companies getting that wrong, whether it's some minor things like when you need the DOT number on a smaller vehicle, all the way up to people that are driving vehicles that needed CDLs and didn't have them. We'll talk about some out of service issues. We're kind of wrapping up the safety blitz here in Wisconsin today, so there's still some increased inspections going on out there, but we'll talk about some things that you can do going down the road to avoid having out of service violations and seeing your DOT safety scores increase. And then lastly, we'll talk about some DOT updates, which the big chunk of that today is the new rules for that entry-level driver training. That's the new rule that we've seen poking its head up lately. So when it comes to fleet, we still see, as I mentioned, the rates on the commercial auto policies are going up. So even though we've seen rates and some refunds on some personal auto insurance policies over the last couple of years with the COVID reductions and driving, auto on the fleet side of on the commercial side of things is still seeing rate increases. It's still the number one way that we have on the job fatalities for just about every industry out there. In construction, you do see some falls taking place as the leading cause, but if you look at all industries across the board, your best chance of somebody dying on the job is still getting into a car accident or an auto accident. It still remains one of the most significant sources of umbrella claims. As Cassie mentioned, I've been doing this insurance thing for about 30 years. I've only seen, I believe, 3 claims in my time that have exhausted the umbrella limits of my policyholders. All 3 of them were auto-related claims, and one was just this past year. Was a case of a vehicle or semi in that situation rear-ended a vehicle because he wasn't paying attention. And when you see fault in those claims, it sees those claims just snowballing. And there's actually a term for that in the insurance world. They call them nuclear verdicts. And you see some of these 20, 50, $100 million claims or lawsuits settled. And it's a lot of times because there was something, whether it was an unsafe vehicle, whether it was an unsafe act that the driver performed, potentially it was just that they weren't following some of the normal regulations for things like drug testing and some of those issues. So, and one of the other issues that's a relatively new one, but maybe not even new, but it's certainly not going away. It's hard to keep and hire good drivers right now. And that's a issue that we have across the board with just about every industry. There's not any magic pill that we can give you to make that one go away, but what we can do is hopefully give you some tools to keep better drivers. And then if we do have to take on drivers that maybe aren't the ideal driver that we've had, we've had that call of, hey, this person had 2 DWIs in the last 3 years. Can we let him drive a vehicle? He's still a good worker for us. There are some things that we can do to maybe minimize the effect of that. And a lot of it just has to do with making sure we identify those drivers. We come up with some corrective actions. We make sure that we've done some defensive driver training or some other things that we can do to maybe make it so that those drivers don't stand out so bad when the carriers are pulling driving records and looking at some of the fleet losses and coming up with your rates for your next renewal. So. If you look back over the last couple of years, obviously COVID has done some crazy things to a lot of industries, the inventory issues right now. You would have thought that we would have seen less fatalities. In Wisconsin, and these statistics are off the Wisconsin DOT website, we actually had increased fatalities both of the last 2 years, including March, April, May. Those months in 2020, we were right at or above the 5-year average for fatalities in Wisconsin. And that's, I think, noteworthy because if you remember, if you've driven the Beltline over those 3 months, there was a lot less driving going on in those 3 months. There was a lot of businesses were still not allowing people to come back into the office. Bars were closed, so you did not have a wave of people leaving the bars at 2 a.m. and getting into DWIs. Doesn't mean that we didn't have drunk drivers on the road yet, but they weren't leaving bars at least. The stats still show that there was a lot of fatalities here in Wisconsin, and a lot of the things that they're doing. I just seen a statistic the other day that said that seatbelt usage has actually gone down for the first time in a while here in Wisconsin. So a lot of things have not changed. Even though we've had less driving, we've still had more fatalities, and that doesn't seem to make any sense. But those are statistics, and that's part of the reason that we've seen increases in auto rates yet, because we still do see a lot of claims as a result of vehicles being on the road. So one of the things that coming from the carrier side that used to, I guess, drive me nuts having to make this recommendation, but we've seen a ton of companies out there that are still not screening drivers properly. And while the carrier will certainly check a driving record, and if you hire a new person, they want to get your driving license numbers from any new drivers so that they can pull a driving record on them. Privacy rules prevent most carriers and agencies from sharing that data with you. So if you have commercial vehicles, which we'll talk about that threshold coming up in a little bit, you need to have a copy of a driving abstract in a driver file. And that information is missing if all you're getting is a thumbs up or a thumbs down from the insurance carrier. So one of the biggest things that I think companies can do is asking the drivers or the employers to make sure that you're pulling driving records and checking those driving records. There's a poll that just popped up here, and I'm going to make sure that I point that out here on the screen, but I'm just kind of curious to see how many of our companies that are people that are on our call today are checking driving records internally, or if you're relying on the agency or the carrier to do that for you and give you that thumbs up. Because best practice is definitely to pull that information yourself. And a big chunk of that is if you're asking the underwriters to keep tabs on your drivers for you, they're doing that at your renewal time. And you do not want your underwriters at renewal time to tell you that you have a bunch of unsafe drivers that you need to do something with, because that is not a time that you want your underwriters finding out that you have questionable drivers. If you're in Wisconsin and you have a bunch of drivers that are Wisconsin only drivers, you can get into the PARS program and use the employer notification program. So PARS is the Public Abstract Request System, and that link is down there in the on the screen, and you can Google Wisconsin PARS and it'll come up on the first search usually. But the PARS program allows employers to access online driving record information, and there's a nominal charge for that. I believe it's less than $12 now to pull a driving record. But the big benefit to the PARS program is you can see what that driver's driving record looks like before you send it to the underwriter and say, hey, we want this person to drive for us. And I would say I would get at least once a month, I would get an underwriter saying, Ken, we just had a request to add a driver. They've had 2 DWIs in the last 2 years and they want to add this person. Can you reach out to this customer and find out what's going on? You need to make sure that you're finding those things out. And the employer notification program that's part of the PARS program is a great benefit. And if I was an employer, this would be something that I would be jumping at the chance to get into, because the state of Wisconsin will send you an email and tell you that you had something post to one of your drivers' driving records, and you should pull that driving record. As soon as you do, you get charged that $12, I believe it is, for a driving abstract, but you can do something about it immediately. And it might have been something minor, like a person's medical card expired and they never got stopped, but their medical card is showing that there's an expiration on it. You can tell them they need to go get that renewed, and nothing hopefully happens in the meantime. It might have been that they got a DWI over a weekend and a couple of months ago, and it posted to their driving record, and they don't even have a valid driver's license. And a lot of employers or employees are not going to come running to you and say, hey, I lost my driving privileges. I probably can't take the company truck out to the job site anymore. This gives you the opportunity to do something about that. The bad part is you have companies that have multi-state exposure that makes it a little harder to do the multi-state searches. And there are search engines out there, and there's a bunch of different companies out there that allow multi-state search options, but not all states offer employer notification. We're kind of surrounded by them here in Wisconsin. I know Illinois is one of those states that does not allow employer notification. So if you have a couple of drivers that live south of the border, that creates a little bit of an HR conflict if everyone in Wisconsin gets ratted out immediately when something posts, and people in Illinois wait until the annual renewal to get found out that they've had no driver's license. So again, there's a lot of options out there. The multi-state one, you lose most of the time the employer notification, but at least you can do something about it. And a lot of times they'll make it up by doing more frequent inspections. So seeing if I can find the tools, and Cassie, you might have to help me here. I saw the screen pop up for showing the results for the poll question, but I'm not able to pull it up anymore on my screen.
Yes, let me share those for you.
Oh, I need to stop sharing, that's why.
So we have 50% saying yes, they do have company screen driving records internally. Then we have 30% saying no, and 20% saying they are not sure and don't know.
Well, that's actually a pretty good number. So I think if we're at that 50%, obviously there's some things that other companies can do, but that's a pretty good start to this. So again, that's, I think, a best practice. If you can screen out your drivers and you know which ones have poor driving records, there are certainly some things that you can do with defensive driver training. You can make sure you're doing some of the telematics and things that we're talking about in a little bit here, but all those are kind of secondary items. And I think past performance is a good indicator of future performance as well. And if you have drivers that have a lead foot, that have some issues with safe driving issues, there's probably a pretty good chance that it's going to create some rate issues for you in your commercial auto insurance premiums. And it's also a pretty good chance that there's going to be some claims out there. Part of this that we would also suggest is that you want to make sure you have a formal fleet safety program to go with that. And again, that's going to spell out some of the things like what an acceptable driving record looks like. Again, having that driving record pulled is a good thing. Having something that you compare it to that says this is acceptable and that you share with your employees or your drivers, so they understand that this is what it takes to continue driving or have driving privileges for us. As a driver who had a few speeding tickets in my younger day, I understand what that does when you are close to that limit, and you may not have a job if you get another ticket. You definitely watch things a little more closely. And it also is going to spell out some things like some of the basic seatbelt regulations, cell phone violations, or cell phone policies. Even though some of those are state law, it's still a good idea to have it in your employee handbook, because it's hard to discipline somebody for something that's maybe they didn't get a ticket for doing something, but they still were caught talking on their cell phone in the vehicle by a passing vehicle or something. Again, those give you the ability to do something about it when there maybe isn't a formal violation that shows up on the driving record, because it's too late at that point too. So the last one is the telematics. And again, consider some telematics or drive cameras in your vehicles, whether it's GPS tracking services, those type of things that'll track the hard starts, hard stops. Drive cameras, I've had some pretty good indication. There's some pretty good cases over the years where a drive camera was a major benefit to a company, where they showed the driver looking both ways before pulling into an intersection and then being hit by a high rate of speed vehicle. I've had other ones where it showed, yes, the driver did something wrong in the vehicle, but at least we know what happened, and it takes away some of the question as to why the driver was involved in it. So these are not necessarily required elements of a fleet safety program, but I do think they kind of start pointing the way to the best practices. And when you start seeing companies out there that have, I think, best in practice fleet safety programs, they're going to include some of these telematics in there, whether it's the snapshot type tools that are plugged into the vehicles. Some of them are just the GPS tracking that allow the you to see where your vehicles are as well. And the drive cameras that are looking forward and backwards, they're great when you have somebody that pulls in front of you in an intersection. Just had one on the Beltline a couple months ago that showed up on a lost run. Had it not been for the drive cam that was in our truck, we would have had a hard time subrogating that claim back to the vehicle that cut off our truck and pushed him into a second or third vehicle. So Cassie, what do we have for our poll results? How many of our companies have some type of telematics?
So let's see, it looks like half of our attendees have at least GPS tracking. 38% have the dash camera. No one selected the driver tracking through cell phones or other, and it looks like 38% had no following telematics.
Okay. I think that's a pretty good number. We have a pretty good group here that obviously has some pretty good controls in place. Again, I think some of those are great tools that help us as we're marketing insurance policies. to different carriers to get the best rates for you guys. Those things help us to be able to point the way to this is a great company and these are things that they're doing to help themselves in that situation. So moving on here just a little bit, I mentioned before that I still have some issues with companies that maybe aren't aware of all the key weights and thresholds when certain regulations start to apply. Everybody seems to think that a lot of these regulations don't kick in until you get to 26,000 pounds. That is certainly one of the thresholds. That is the CDL weight of a vehicle. But a lot of regulations start when a vehicle becomes what they consider a commercial motor vehicle. And a commercial motor vehicle is any vehicle that's over 10,000 pounds gross vehicle weight rating, or the gross combined weight rating, which means the vehicle and the trailer. That's not the actual weight of the vehicle, that's the tag that's in the door or that's on the trailer that says this is the maximum amount this trailer is rated to pull or this vehicle is rated to haul. When you take your typical half-ton crew cab pickup, it's going to have a gross vehicle weight rating of about 7,000 pounds. There are some under, some over, depending on the engine classification and four-wheel drive and all those other things. You put a typical little single axle trailer on there that has a 2995 gross vehicle weight rating because it's just under licensing requirements in the state of Wisconsin, you're right at that number. And depending on if your vehicle had a 7,100 pound gross vehicle weight rating or a 7,000 pound gross vehicle weight rating, it could be a commercial motor vehicle going down the road, a half-ton pickup with a trailer that doesn't even need a license plate on it. When you start getting into larger trailers, 3/4 ton vehicles, half-ton, 1 ton, 3/4 ton vehicles, or certainly any of those larger ones, even if it doesn't require a CDL, a lot of the regulations still start to kick in. The DOT markings on the vehicle, which is the DOT number, name of the company, all that stuff that has to be on the door, needs to be on the side of the vehicle when it's running down the road over 10,000 pounds. Vehicle inspections, which includes the annual, the post-trip, pre-trip inspections, need to be done on commercial motor vehicles. So again, if you're pulling a trailer occasionally with a half-ton pickup, it may need that annual maintenance sticker on a half-ton pickup, especially when it has a trailer in tow. Hours of service regulations actually kick in if you're crossing the state lines. So if you're leaving the state of Wisconsin and you're going into Illinois or Iowa or Minnesota or Michigan, obviously, we need to have hours of service regulations followed. And again, even the ELD rules could start to apply depending on how many days in a month that they're driving outside of the short haul exemption. The medical cards, there's another one that applies. So when they're leaving the state of Wisconsin, they don't necessarily need a CDL, but they need a medical card in a commercial motor vehicle to cross state lines. When you start exceeding the 26,000 pound mark, and again, it's actually over 26,000, so it's 26,001 pounds or greater, or a combination of vehicles when it's combined with a trailer that has over 10,000 pound rating, it becomes a CDL vehicle. So a 14,000 pound 1 ton pickup pulling a 16,000 pound trailer is over 26,000 pounds combined. So the truck itself wouldn't be a CDL vehicle without the trailer, but when you put a heavy enough trailer on it, it becomes a CDL vehicle. In the state of Wisconsin, they can actually use actual weight as well. So actual weight would be if we overloaded our stuff a little bit, we could come into some of those two rules. Most of the time, we're mostly concerned with the actual rating of the vehicles, not so much the actual weight of the vehicles. But that's when we need a CDL license, we need full drug testing regulations, rules followed, medical cards, unless you're grandfathered. So again, in the state of Wisconsin, we can be grandfathered for our med card. We cannot be grandfathered for crossing the state lines. And certainly the hours of service kicks in there too as well, even if you're just staying in the state of Wisconsin. And again, there are some short haul exemptions for that a lot of companies get by with what they call the time card rule if you're starting and stopping your day within 12 hours. We get into a lot of regulations here though that we could spend a full hour on individually. We're gonna try not to do that for this webinar because we have a bunch of other topics we still wanna get through today. So that is a couple of the items. There are a couple other thresholds. Most of what I focus on is the weight of vehicles because most of the customers that I deal with are not necessarily limousine services or school bus services, but there are regulations that require CDLs for 8-passenger vehicles for hire. So if you're again a limousine company or something like that, or vehicles that have greater than 16 passenger capacity for not for hire. So if you're a construction company and you purchased a minibus to send people up to Eau Claire for a job site, that is a CDL required vehicle. Even a 16 passenger van requires a CDL to operate that one before it's pulling that many people. And again, it's not how many people are in the van, it's how many people it was rated for. And there's also some issues with hazardous materials. Again, a good friend of mine was a former federal motor carrier person. His example he always gave was if you had a Harley Davidson and you stopped at a fireworks display store and you bought fireworks, some bottle rockets that you were going to bring back up here and sell to a company in Madison, that requires you to have a CDL license and a hazmat endorsement on your Harley Davidson because explosives has a very small plaque particle quantity. So again, it's for commerce, meaning you're selling or you're using the vehicle in the furtherance of your business, not necessarily if you just bought those to take up to your cabin for the weekend. So, but again, there are some other regulations for CDL requirements in that situation. So now I'm just a little curious to see the types of companies that we have here. So I think you're going to see another poll pop up here just to see where we're at with how many companies have CDL vehicles. Cassie, how did we do on our poll here? How many companies?
Just 1 second. Looks like some people are still putting in their responses. And let's see. So 75% have CDL required vehicles, 25% have commercial motor vehicles, and no one has those smaller non-CMV vehicles.
Okay. Excellent. So we do have a pretty good group of people here that have some fairly significant DOT regulations, which gets into our next one, which I'm always a good fan of watching your CAB scores or your safety management scores. So CAB is the Central Analytics Bureau. It's a paid service, and here at Houseman, we have access to see some of those things. You don't necessarily have to get into that. You can go to the FMCSA website, log into the safety management system, and you'll see the same 7 basic categories, and you'll see what type of violations your drivers had. Because a lot of times I see companies that they don't necessarily find out about every violation that a driver gets. They may be hiding these things. They may have just paid for them themselves. They may just not be willing to come back and advertise that they were caught doing something they shouldn't have been caught doing. So again, there's a couple different ways you can do that. The safety management system, if I'm not logged into it, what I see is like the example of the vehicle maintenance score there. 8.41 is a time-weighted number, and it reflects the actual violations that you had, and you can drill those down and see what type of violations you have there. But it doesn't help me understand where I rank in there, and that ranking is the most important thing that you can look at. And that's where, if you're logged into the safety management system or you have access to get a CAB report, you can see where you rank in terms of other companies and other fleets of similar size fleets. So again, in the situation of that little CAB score up in the upper left, it shows a 7% ranking for crash. So 7% is way under the 65% threshold where that company would get audited for having an unsafe record. But when you start approaching any of those audit thresholds, so it's either 65% for unsafe driving, for crashes or hours of service, or 80% for fitness of your drivers, which is the CDL type things and your med cards, vehicle maintenance scores, which is pretty self-explanatory and probably the one that I see the most issues with, or the other 2 hazardous materials or crash indicators there. I'm sorry, not crash indicators, the controlled substances. When you start getting up into those 2 thresholds, you get above that red bar there, those become auditable. So that's when you're going to get a call from the DOT, and they're going to be knocking on your door, and they're going to want to start reviewing your safety records and all your files. And that's not a fun process to go through. Certainly can come up with a bunch of fines if you're not following the rules and regulations properly. But I do suggest that you watch those, because I've had my share of issues over the years where things showed up on a DOT number that didn't belong there. whether it was an out-of-state violation for a company that's, I've seen issues where trucks were sold and they had the DOT number on the door and they got cited in Illinois for driving without proper, some maintenance violations were in effect, but it was a vehicle that was traded the year prior, but it's still the DOT number on the door, so it showed up in a different state. Again, keep an eye on those things. Sometimes you'll have a driver that was ticketed for something and maybe they got out of that ticket, took it to court and got out of that violation for some reason. Again, those things you can go through the data queues process and have them taken off of that score so it's not affecting it, because you don't want that score to be high. As a carrier, when I was on the carrier side, we would certainly look at both of these numbers and we'd look to see if they were unsafe companies. And when you start getting above 50% of any of your scores, obviously it means that you are in the worst 50 percentile of similar companies in the nation. That's not good for your rates, plain and simple. If you're way below that, it's obviously something that we can use to help market that to different prospective carriers and say, hey, look what they've done with their safety management scores here. So again, keep an eye on those things, watch for trends. There are certainly a bunch of them that you look here that you see some things that are low-hanging fruit that we'll talk about with load securement issues, like the one in the middle there that had some improper load securement. Those are things that are pretty easy things to fix and address. Some of the other ones, I think it's very difficult for somebody to get stopped because they had a horn that was inoperable. Those are things that they don't find until they get you pulled over and they're doing a full inspection of your vehicle. So I'm going to suggest that you keep an eye on that and keep watching for that low-hanging fruit is what I call it. So most of the time you'll see vehicles that get cited for things. A lot of times there was something that stood out when you look at the vehicle, whether it was a driver who was speeding, going through a zone and had some speeding issues. And again, there was an article in the Journal Sentinel many years ago that said most drivers in this Milwaukee County didn't get stopped until they were doing 15 miles an hour over the limit or more. That is not the case with commercial motor vehicles. We see a lot of vehicles that are getting stopped for doing 6 and 7 over the speed limit in certain areas, and not just in Rosendale, Wisconsin, which is notorious for getting stopped. But you see a lot of trucks that will get stopped because once they get you stopped, now they can see that you have a tire that's got bald tread. They can see that you have a fire extinguisher that wasn't secured or was discharged. They can find those hours of service violations and other things. The other one is somebody who's talking on a cell phone. And that's something that you need to be careful of as well, because that is a major violation in that safety management score. It is a 10-point violation, right up there with a DWI. So when that shows up on that record, that is a major hit to your safety management scores if they're not following proper procedures, which again, that rule is a relatively old rule now, so I won't go into great details, but you're allowed one touch of something that's not on your phone. So it could be your headset, could be the Bluetooth radio button on the steering wheel. They do allow some discussions on a phone, but you do need to be careful with that as well. The carrier that I came from, my company car, I wasn't even allowed to use my Bluetooth because it's obviously a mental distraction to the driver to be talking on a phone while they're driving down the road. Seatbelt violations. That one is one that's a little bit of a hidden treasure, if you will. When you look at the seatbelt violation in the state of Wisconsin, I believe it's still a $15 citation. It might have went up to $25. Relatively insignificant compared to a $200 speeding ticket even for doing 12 over the limit. Those violations seem relatively minor. And there was a time when companies or drivers would try to take a speeding ticket into a courtroom and try to get it turned into something like a seatbelt violation or something to see if they could get the points off the record, because a seatbelt violation doesn't come with points. However, in the DOT world, that is a 7-point violation to your safety management score. And that is, again, right up there. It's not a 10-point violation, but it's a pretty significant one. And there are a lot of carriers out there that will not hire a driver who has a seatbelt violation, because I can tell you that there are speeding tickets that people get because they maybe didn't see a sign, maybe they didn't realize the speed they were going, and you can make excuses for a lot of things. But a seatbelt violation is one of those things that it's a choice that a driver makes, and if they're in the habit of not wearing a seatbelt, it is a pretty good indicator of the overall type of safe driver that they are. And again, I would caution companies, if you're going to hire somebody that has seatbelt violations on it, some carriers are a little more strict than others on how they view a seatbelt violation. Cargo securement issues. Again, if you're driving box trucks down the road and all your freight is enclosed, that's a little harder to get cited for. But if you have open deck trailers and you're hauling heavy equipment, that is one of the things that I do suggest that you keep an eye on, make sure the drivers understand how many load securement devices they need on each piece of equipment for weight and for length of the cargo that they're hauling. They need to make sure they're following both of those. And then any obvious maintenance issues on the vehicles. And again, probably the biggest thing on those, it's lights that are out. If you're doing a good job with your pre-trip inspections, they're checking tail lights, they're checking the cargo lights and all the other, the clearance lights and all the other lights that are required to be on a vehicle. That's one of the low-hanging fruits. That is, a vehicle goes past a state patrol officer on the highway and they see that there's a brake light out. It's a very easy thing for them to pull you over and issue a citation for a required light being out. And again, now they've got you pulled over, they can see some of the other things. They can hear the audible air leaks on the brakes, or they can hear or see the brake adjusters that are out of adjustment. Those things stand out a lot easier when the vehicle's on the side of the road than when they're driving past them at 60 miles an hour. So keep an eye on those things. Again, watch for those trends to start. Talk to your drivers about them as they're getting these things. It's a good reminders for them as far as paycheck stuffers or what type of driver training they're getting. So the last topic is kind of some of the new DOT regulations, and this is what kind of started this whole webinar, was the new rule that the federal motor carriers came up with for CDL drivers. So in the past, a person could go to the DMV website, they could get signed up to take the test to get a commercial driver's learning permit, and they could spend some time working for a driver, go through the third-party testing procedure, and boom, they have a CDL. The new requirement now is that all CDL applicants have to meet a national baseline for entry-level driver training, and a big chunk of that is that they have to go through training that is provided by a trainer who's listed on the National Registry for new CDL drivers, the ELDT registry, if you will. That link has come up in a second here, but essentially you have to prove that they have to complete the training in the state of Wisconsin before they will accept the third-party testing here. They need to prove that they completed all of the training that's required of them now. So there's no hiding that they didn't do the training properly anymore, essentially. Entry-level drivers must complete the applicable training from somebody who's listed on that registry prior to taking the skills test and the knowledge test to get their actual CDL license. That rule went into effect on February 7th. There are some people that maybe have their commercial learner's permit as of February 7th that are exempt from that. However, we're kind of coming to the end of that because it's only a 6-month process, and if that's expired, they're going to need to renew that, and once they renew that, they're going to have to go through the ELDT process. So, and again, that also applies to company or to a driver who may be going for a new or a different type of CDL. So maybe they had a Class B and they're going to a Class A. Maybe they're applying for a Class B. Maybe they're adding some type of endorsement on there. Those endorsements, again, if they're going to add an endorsement to their CDL, most of the time they're going to have to take that through somebody who has the right credentials listed with the ELDT registry. To get to the website, you can go to the fmcsa.gov website. That'll show up as one of the training registry links, and you have two options here. One is to find a training provider, and it will take you to a website. It will download an Excel spreadsheet, which I have an example coming up here. And you can see all of the providers in your area. I will caution you that there are some that are private on there. So there are a lot of bus companies that will train their own drivers and listed themselves on the registry, but they are not open to sending your drivers there. So make sure if you're looking for somebody to send your people through that it's a public entity, and they'll probably tell you real quickly if you tried to send somebody there. But the other one is if you have a lot of drivers that you're going to send, maybe you hire 20, 30, 50 drivers a year or more, you may want to list yourself as a registered training provider. And again, it's a self-certification process, and there's a pretty good tutorial on there. We'll chat just briefly about it coming up here. But you can get yourself listed as a training provider, and then you can train your drivers just as you might have in the past. If you have a very good CDL driver who's been training people, maybe an option to consider. It probably doesn't make sense if you're only doing a handful of drivers every year, though. It's probably easier to just send them to one of the providers that's listed. So I've searched the website and I pulled the Excel spreadsheet here, and there's over 20,000 providers, and that number could have changed since I pulled this a couple weeks ago. Over 15,000 of them are private. So there's only about 5,000 companies in the nation that are going to be training drivers. That seems like a small number, but it's actually probably adequate. And it's, a lot of the companies that you would see around here, the Diesel Truck Driver Training School in Sun Prairie is one that shows up here. That is one of the local companies that you can send people to here in Sun Prairie in the Madison area. In Wisconsin, we have about 525 companies. 71 of them offer some type of public training, but if you look on the side there are some that offer only behind the wheel training. So again, if you're going to self-certify for this, you have to make sure that you're doing the right ones for either the theory, which is the classroom, the behind the wheel range, which is the parking lot, or the behind the wheel, which is on the road training. To be listed on there, you can self-certify. You have to make sure that you are meeting all of the components of Title 49, Part 380, subparts F and G. You can list yourself as either a public or private enrollment. And the process is actually detailed in the video that's on the link down there. So it's actually a fairly simple process to go through. They start with having somebody list themselves and getting the company and the administrator listed for the company. And once they're there, then they can start adding driver training locations if you have multiple locations, and you can add additional users if you have people that are going to be handling the behind the wheel for you, as well as just the classroom. That training video is pretty good as to how it walks you through the process, but you have to self-certify that you have gone through the registration process. You're going to follow the right curriculum. You have instructors that meet the qualifications, which most of the time means that they've had a CDL for at least 2 years to do the training. Your facility has to meet the requirements. You can't have your training at a local tavern in the afternoon. It needs to be at an actual training facility. You have to have the right vehicles to provide the training. Again, I can't give you a CDL training in a Prius. I need to make sure I have the right vehicle to do the training. You have to be state licensed, again, for the type of license that you have. The assessments are going to be followed. It all spells out all of those requirements so that you can go through the certification process. And again, once you're through that, you get registered, then students have to be trained on, in the classroom, 5 basic categories, and there are 29 subpoints to that. You have to follow each of them to a T, and each student has to be tested and score more than 80% on that test for each of those. Similarly to the behind the wheel, there's a range section and a behind the wheel on the public road section. There are 7 basic things that have to be followed for the range, 12 basic things have to be followed for the road. You have to make sure you're following each of those. There's some training required, and you have to make sure that you're going through those in detail. You can't skip any of them because, again, it's something that you have to certify before they can go get their road test. There are separate curriculums. If you're going to upgrade from a B to an A, there's a limited, much smaller curriculum. The one you just saw was for a Class A CDL. There are different requirements for, obviously, somebody who's seeking a Class B CDL, a passenger endorsement, or a school bus endorsement, and obviously the hazmat is a major difference in those things. And again, to go through that training, you're going to need to have somebody that has 2 years of experience as a CDL holder with the same or higher endorsement level. So I can't give you a school bus endorsement if all I have is a Class A. I have to make sure I have somebody that has the school bus endorsement if I need a school bus endorsement trainer. To do the training behind the wheel, again, they need to have 2 years of driving experience out there as well, and it has to be a valid license. You cannot do the behind the wheel training on a road if your trainer has lost their CDL, if there's been suspended or revoked. So again, you have to make sure that the driver meets the proper criteria as well before they're allowed to train somebody. So that's the new ELD rule, or ELDT rule, sorry, the entry level driver training rule. There are a couple other new things going on. I mentioned a little bit ago that the safety blitz is going on this week. It ends today actually, but that's the blitz where they're pulling over a lot more vehicles and looking for a lot more things at the scales, doing a lot more detailed inspections. According to their federal website, the focus has been on wheels and anything wheel related, whether they're checking temperature of the hubs and the looking for lug nuts, rust on the wheels and those things that are flat tires. Anything wheel related, they're saying, has been a focus of this year's safety blitz. Not trying to make this a political argument here, but there's also a public comment period on the mandatory speed limiters for large trucks that popped up again this year. It's the second time the governors or speed limiters has come up for possible new registration or regulations. I don't know if that's going to gain any traction. The regulations, they say they're not really specifying if it's going to be 60, 65, or 68 miles an hour at this point yet. But I think a lot of the data that you've seen out there has been pretty negative from most of the companies that are responding to this so far. You know, I'm not going to tell you how to do that, but if you're concerned that your vehicles are all going to have to start driving 60 miles an hour, it might behoove you to do the comment period. And the other one that's out there on the state website right now, or on the federal website, there's a pilot program for allowing younger drivers to operate in interstate transit. So as a 19-year-old driver, I can have a CDL in the state of Wisconsin and I can drive vehicle in the state of Wisconsin, but I can't start driving an interstate until I'm 21. The new policy that they have is a pilot program that you have to be approved to get into, is allowing certain companies to try to bring on younger drivers in interstate transit. Again, I know there's an issue with bringing in young drivers or new drivers and filling those seats, but you know, be cautious with that, because somebody who's been driving at 18 years old only has 2 years of experience. So if you're going to hire somebody as an 18-year-old driver, if you allow somebody to have 3 moving violations in a 3-year period, but this driver has 2 of them in a 2-year period, you know, there needs to be some scrutiny, I think, for some of those younger drivers when they're behind the wheel for your vehicles as well. So even if you're not in that pilot program and they're just driving maybe a pickup truck to and from a construction site or something, just be cautious with that one. Younger drivers should fall under a little more scrutiny because they don't have the experience yet. So that said, that was, I believe, the end of my slide here, and I'm right up to the end of my 45-minute time period here. So I don't know if Cassie, if you had any closing comments, or if we had any comments, questions that popped up, I can stay or I can reach out afterwards. So.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We are going to do a question and answer session right now. So if you have any questions for Ken over any of the things he's talked about, or you'd like to ask him a safety question, something that you're going through with your company, you can type it into the question feature and he can answer it right now in live time. So I will start with the first question that came in, and it is, so is CDL requirement only if truck plus trailers equal 26,000 pounds, or is it for any trailer rated at 10,000 pounds or above?
Nope, the combination has to be over 26, inclusive of a trailer that is over 10. So again, a 27,000 pound box truck would be a CDL required vehicle. A 16,000 pound truck pulling an 8,000 pound vehicle or an 8,500 pound vehicle is not a CDL vehicle. Even though it's over 26,000 pounds, it is over 26,000 pounds, but not inclusive of the trailer that's over 10. So it has to be both of those together.
Thanks for the answer. The second question is, do municipal vehicles require a DOT number?
That is a good question. I don't believe I've ever seen a DOT number on a municipal vehicle, but I'm going to check that now as I'm driving around today, and that may be one that I want to get back to you on. It is for the furtherance of a business and a commerce as part of the DOT regulation there. So I'm not sure that the DOT rules apply as wholeheartedly to the municipal operations. Doesn't mean that it's not still good to follow all of the normal procedures that we just talked about for some of the safety things that go on behind the scenes, because you have just as much potential to have crashes and fatalities and, poor auto claims that drive up insurance premiums and things there too. So I'm not sure I understand the DOT number on the door for a commercial. My guess is yes, but don't quote me on that one. I'll have to get back to you on that one.
And Leah, if I remember correctly, I think you're in Monona, so you're in a pretty local area, so we can probably get that answer to you pretty quick.
Yep. Do we have any others?
Any other questions for Ken while we still have him on the line? I'll give a couple seconds if people are typing in something. All right, it looks like there are no more questions. Thank you guys so much for coming. We really appreciate you taking time to join our live webinars. If you could fill out the short survey for us, you will get that at the end once the webinar has ended. And just a reminder that you will receive a copy of the slides along with a link to the recording emailed to you as well. Thank you again so much, Ken, for sharing your knowledge with us. I know I learned some things about road safety, and I'm not even someone who works in that. So I appreciate it very much. And thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your morning and stay safe.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate your time too.